The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration in the U.S. Armed Forces. Since its inception in 1861, over 3,500 U.S. soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, guardians, and Coast Guardsmen have been awarded this prestigious medal, recognizing their immense sacrifice, dedication to the service, and acts of profound valor and heroism. However, it doesn't happen often that these acts of heroism are caught on tape, immortalizing the spirit of courage for generations to come. This is the story of the first Medal of Honor act ever recorded on video. This is the story of John A. Chapman. But this story won't start in the middle of the action, during the short but unbelievably tense Battle of Takur Ghar in 2002 that claimed the lives of 7 US service members and would have been even deadlier if it wasn't for Chapman. No, this story begins long before the first bullet flew on that fateful day in March. It begins with Chapman's unwavering dedication to his country and his skills, both of which explain why he was able to rise to the occasion when the moment of truth arrived. Technical Sergeant John A. Chapman enlisted in the U.S. Air Force on September 27, 1985. He started off as an information systems operator, but volunteered to become a special tactics combat controller a few years down the line. As a combat controller, he was trained to handle air and ground challenges across different conflict and crisis scenarios. Competent and efficient, Chapman successfully graduated from the combat control courses and soon received his first special tactics assignment. The assignment in question had him join the 1721st Combat Control Squadron at the Pope Air Force Base in North Carolina in 1990. From North Carolina, he went to Japan, where he served as a Special Tactics team member with the 320th Special Tactics Squadron at the Kadena Air Base in Okinawa from 1992 to 95. In October 1995, Chapman was selectively hired for a special duty assignment that had him back at the Pope Air Force Base, but this time with the 24th Special Tactics Squadron. Recognized as a top performer in his career field, he became a leader within the squadron, prepping personnel for the rigors of combat, personnel recovery, precision strikes, and much more. Chapman himself was trained for a variety of specialized missions: immediate deployment into combat operations, infiltration in combat and austere environments, reconnaissance operations, air traffic control, and terminal attack control operations, static line and military freefall jumping and combat diving. In other words, John A. Chapman was a true warrior, embodying the pinnacle of special tactics expertise. This expertise was what propelled Chapman into his next chapter, Afghanistan, which sadly also turned out to be the last chapter of his story. It's a chapter that's actually a part of a much bigger story, the global war on terrorism. After the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 shook the US to its core, the country launched a military campaign to combat terrorism and dismantle the infrastructure that supported it. This campaign, known as the Global War on Terrorism, aimed to bring those responsible for the attacks to justice and prevent such atrocities from happening again in the future. Since Osama bin Laden, the founder of the al-Qaeda terrorist network, was responsible for the 9/11 attacks, it shouldn't be surprising that Afghanistan became the focal point of the initial military response to the global war on terrorism. After all, the country was notorious for providing a safe haven and training grounds for al-Qaeda members. So the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7, 2001, the first stage of the war in Afghanistan. Though this operation eventually managed to drive al-Qaeda into retreat and topple the Taliban regime that supported it, it wasn't without its challenges. The mountainous terrain of the landlocked Afghanistan was among the biggest challenges. The same goes for the irregular warfare tactics that at first confounded the US forces, accustomed to conventional combat. Both of these challenges plagued Operation Anaconda, a joint military operation within Enduring Freedom, whose goal was to surround and defeat the al-Qaeda fighters hiding in the Khost Gardez region. The Shah-e-Kot Valley, which was the primary target area within the region, proved extremely difficult for planning large-scale military operations. Why? Listen to its description and see for yourself. The Shah-e-Kot Valley sat roughly 8,500 feet above sea level and held a collection of remote villages flanked by towering mountains on the east. One of these mountains was the 11,000-foot-tall Takur Ghar, the place of Chapman's last stand. The Shah-e-Kot Valley also only had 2 vehicle-accessible entry and exit points, located at its northern and southern ends respectively. That's why the Operation Anaconda planners deemed helicopters the best way to move the US soldiers into the valley. However, this too wasn't an ideal solution. The Bagram Air Base and Kandahar Airfield, the main operating bases for coalition forces in Afghanistan, were both located at significant distances from the Shah-e-Kot Valley. Combine these long and dangerous flights with the high elevation of the valley, and it becomes clear that these helicopters couldn't carry many troops or heavy combat loads. That's not to mention how impractical the rocky terrain and steep slopes in the valley made it for helicopters to offload troops and supplies. In fact, this could only be done in two areas: deep down in the valley or up on the mountain peaks. But just because landing in these areas was technically feasible doesn't mean it was without significant risks. The risk in this situation mainly had to do with the Al-Qaeda and Taliban lookouts in the region, who would have no issue spotting enemy troops approaching via air. However, the Al-Qaeda and Taliban lookouts weren't the only problem. So were their fighters, who fully intended to stay and engage the Americans instead of flee, as the Operation Anaconda planners predicted. So the first few days of Operation Anaconda were rough, to say the least. A few US soldiers were killed in friendly fire after being mistaken for Al-Qaeda. American pilots dropped only 7 bombs in the valley, which only managed to alert the Al-Qaeda and Taliban formations of the incoming attack instead of weakening their position. A major task force within the operation, Task Force Hammer, was completely halted by Al-Qaeda mortar and machine gun crews. There was issue after issue after issue. Yet, the US forces didn't give up. It was this persistence that alerted the Al-Qaeda's Chechen and Uzbek fighters of the military value of the area. The summit of Takur Ghar was of particular importance because whoever controlled this summit also controlled all the southern approaches to the valley, effectively dominating the battlefield. So the Al-Qaeda fighters responded by standing their ground in well-concealed bunkers and trenches on the summit. They were armed with AK-47 rifles, rocket-propelled and hand grenades, and PKM and DSHK machine guns. They seemingly also had Mother Nature on their side, as over 3 feet of snow accumulated on the peak on March 3rd, further concealing their bunkers and trenches. That's why the US SEAL Team Mako 30, sent to take control of the peak, didn't really stand a chance from the get-go. The team, in a Boeing MH-47 Chinook helicopter, flew right into Al-Qaeda's lap and was swiftly attacked with a rocket-propelled grenade before it could even attempt a landing. The grenade pierced the left side fuselage of the helicopter and damaged its electrical and hydraulic systems. In an attempt to escape the field of fire, the helicopter gave a violent lurch. Unfortunately, the sudden movement caused one of the Navy SEALs on board, Petty Officer First Class Neil C. Roberts, to fall from the helicopter into the snow below. As soon as the pilot and the crew realized what had happened, they wanted to go back for Roberts, but the helicopter was simply too damaged for this endeavor. So it was forced to land further down the mountain, about 3 miles away. However, the Mako 30 crew remained determined to rescue their fallen comrade. As soon as they could, they boarded another helicopter, Razor 04, and went back to the 11,000-foot mountaintop. At around 5 a.m., Razor 04 prepared to land in the exact spot where its predecessor met its fate. What followed was the single most dramatic and deadliest event of the Battle of Takur Ghar, a 17-hour ordeal marked by equal parts tragedy and heroism. As you can probably guess, Chapman was a part of the courageous crew that stood by the motto, "Never leave a man behind." In fact, he was the second person to come off the helicopter ramp and bolt straight into the heat of the battle in knee-deep snow. He headed left in search of high ground or shelter that would allow him to orchestrate air power support. At first, enemy fire was incoming from every direction, but was mostly concentrated on the helicopter, even after it started to take off. All of a sudden, the mountain went silent. The Al-Qaeda fighters stopped firing bullets, trying to determine what happened in the commotion. The Navy SEAL team had yet to fire a single shot. As soon as the firing restarted all around, Chapman made a snap decision to run directly into the flurry of bullets. This meant running upslope in thigh-deep snow while constantly being targeted. He fired back, sending the cartridges from his M4 carbine echoing through the valley. Chapman's team leader, Britt Slabinski, another Medal of Honor recipient, saw Chapman upslope and started following his trail through the snow, some 20 feet behind. However, Slabinski never caught up to Chapman. All he was able to do was watch as Chapman charged uphill with unwavering determination, switching between running and snapping off shots at the bunker ahead, later designated as Bunker 1. It soon became clear to Slabinski and everyone watching the recording that Chapman was charging the Bunker 1 all on his own. Since there was no cover for him to take, he called in airstrikes to slow the Al-Qaeda attack. Chapman realized that if the incessant firing from the bunker continued, there would be no one left to even defend on that mountaintop. So he soldiered on, making his way to the fortified bunker located in an arc under a 10-foot-tall bonsai-shaped tree. Inside the bunker there were 2 enemy fighters armed with AK-47s. They were well protected and masked by the tree overhead, as well as a large rock outcrop to the left of the bunker, which became known as the Boulder. Some 25 feet behind sat Bunker 2, which housed 2 more fighters armed with a PKM heavy machine gun and several rocket-propelled grenades. But a more disturbing discovery lay between Bunker 1 and the Boulder, unbeknownst to Chapman. The body of slain SEAL Neil Roberts, the man for whom the Mako 30 crew had bravely returned to rescue, lay motionless in the snow. There are conflicting reports on when exactly Roberts was killed. Some say he died immediately after falling from the helicopter, while others say he fought for at least an hour before meeting his tragic end. Whatever the case, Roberts was executed at close range, likely with a single shot to the back of the head. To honor his memory, the Battle of Takur Ghar is often referred to as the Battle of Roberts Ridge. But although Roberts was gone, the battle raged on. Chapman was now some 10 feet away from Bunker 1, appearing to materialize out of thin air to the 2 combatants. The sudden appearance of Chapman meant that in a matter of seconds, he made sure there were no more Al-Qaeda fighters in Bunker 1. This endeavor alone was enough to earn Chapman his Medal of Honor, but he was not done. Now in command of Bunker 1, Chapman immediately turned his attention to the next threat, Bunker 2. However, this time, he wasn't going in alone. Slabinski finally caught up to him, joining him inside Bunker 1. Together, they started engaging the inhabitants of Bunker 2. Unfortunately, their attempts to neutralize the targets from inside Bunker 1 were unsuccessful, so Chapman deliberately moved into the open to gain a better vantage point. However, charging Bunker 2 proved more difficult than his attempt on Bunker 1. This time, Chapman was the one who got shot 2 times, collapsing in the snow. When Chapman stopped moving altogether, Slabinski concluded that he was dead. So he ordered a teammate armed with an M60 to engage Bunker 2, as it represented the biggest threat to the crew's survival. Sadly, the 60-gunner was soon injured as well, struck by grenade shrapnel that made him tumble 10 feet down the mountain, right at Slabinski's feet. A video recording of this unfortunate event shows Slabinski and the wounded gunner conferring about his injuries before making a highly consequential decision. The Mako 30 team had to retreat, and they had to do so without Roberts and Chapman, both of whom the crew concluded were dead. The team swiftly slid down the mountain, trying to retreat. While doing so, they passed Roberts' body, but unfortunately didn't see Chapman. The only team member who knew where Chapman had fallen was Slabinski, but as mentioned, he believed Chapman was beyond saving. Unfortunately, in the sheer chaos of the moment, he didn't check whether this was actually true. The same chaos and desperation also prompted Slabinski to order uncontrolled airstrikes from a circling Lockheed AC-130 gunship, which subsequently showered the mountaintop in 105mm howitzer rounds that could have very likely hit Chapman. However, additional analysis of the UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle video feed from the battle showed that Chapman was in fact not dead. The 2 shots he suffered from the enemy only incapacitated him, but following the retreat, he was left alone among ruthless Al-Qaeda fighters with at least 1 mortal wound. So what did he do? Continue fighting until his last breath. That's what. Some 20 minutes after Razor 04 reached the summit, Chapman awoke. He first tried to get in touch with his team, initiating a series of radio calls. These calls were received at a nearby summit. However, Chapman never acknowledged the radio responses, most likely due to the excessive noise around him or equipment failure. So despite experiencing severe blood loss and shock, he began his final one-man stand against at least 24 enemy fighters. This stand lasted for over 40 minutes, during which Chapman received several gunshot and grenade shrapnel wounds. But even with his shrapnel-ridden and bleeding body, he managed to take out an enemy fighter in hand-to-hand combat. Shortly after, the sound of heavy rotors of another helicopter could be heard approaching the mountaintop. But if Chapman felt relief at that point, it was probably short-lived. There was no way for the helicopter to land if it didn't have cover by anyone on the mountaintop. And if the Al-Qaeda fighters were to take over his Bunker 1, they could easily take out the entire crew of the helicopter, which held as many as 18 of his comrades. Of course, Chapman had no way of knowing how many soldiers were in the helicopter, but for him, the number probably didn't matter. After he loaded the last of his ammunition, Chapman started engaging enemies in all directions. He even climbed out of the bunker, exposing himself to even greater danger in a desperate attempt to provide cover for his comrades. Unfortunately, he wasn't successful. The helicopter was eventually struck by a rocket-propelled grenade, forcing the pilot to make a controlled crash. Meanwhile, Chapman continued firing to cover his comrades as they exited the helicopter. Though 3 of them were fatally shot, there could have been many more casualties if it wasn't for Chapman. Unfortunately, Chapman soon succumbed to his injuries. There were simply too many incoming rounds for one man to fight off, no matter how courageous he might have been. In the end, it took 9 bullets and numerous shrapnel wounds to take down Chapman. His body, along with those of the other casualties, would be extracted after nightfall, officially ending the Battle of Takur Ghar. But sporadic gunfire continued raging throughout the day after Chapman was struck down. US troops realized that the only way of getting off that mountaintop was to destroy all al-Qaeda fighters, so they called in air support from F-16 fighter jets and Predator drones armed with AGM-114 Hellfire missiles to pound the al-Qaeda positions. By 11:30 a.m., the peak was cleared. Al-Qaeda made several attempts to reclaim Takur Ghar, all repelled by the SEALs and Rangers, relying on air support and small arms fire. Unfortunately, the unity shown in the battle between the US military branches wasn't on display in the aftermath of this deadly battle. In determining what actually happened at the Battle of Takur Ghar, there were 2 opposing sides, the US Navy and the US Air Force. According to reports, the US Navy categorically denied that Chapman survived the initial 2 bullets, a claim that, if accepted, would also erase his extraordinarily heroic last stand. The US Air Force, however, was adamant about the fact that the Navy SEALs abandoned Chapman while he was still alive, which the drone feed eventually confirmed. It's why the Air Force pushed for Chapman to receive a posthumous Medal of Honor. It would be some 16 years before Chapman would be awarded this prestigious medal. Initially, he was awarded the Air Force Cross in 2003 for his courageous actions on Takur Ghar. He became the first Air Force combat controller to receive this honor. In 2018, he also became the first airman since the Vietnam War to receive a Medal of Honor for his actions. The Medal of Honor was awarded by then-President Donald Trump with the following description: by direction of the President of the United States, authorized by Title 10, Section 8741 USC, the following individual is awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty in military operations against an armed enemy of the United States. The description goes on to break down Chapman's heroic endeavor, emphasizing that he engaged the enemies without regard for his own safety. The description adds that Chapman fearlessly charged an enemy bunker and continued to fight relentlessly despite severe mortal wounds before making the ultimate sacrifice. But his list of firsts doesn't stop there. Chapman was also the first Special Tactics Airman to receive a Medal of Honor. He was also posthumously promoted to Master Sergeant John A. Chapman on August 24, 2018. This happened only a day after Chapman was inducted into the Hall of Heroes. Of course, words can only capture a fraction of the courage and sacrifice Technical Sergeant John A. Chapman demonstrated in Afghanistan. Let's not forget he was the first Medal of Honor recipient whose heroic actions were electronically recorded. Interestingly, SEAL team leader Britt Slabinski, who we mentioned earlier, was also awarded the Medal of Honor the same year, which leads to a bit of controversy surrounding the conditions for receiving the medal. President Trump's statement regarding the presentation of the award stated that Slabinski was unquestionably deserving of this honor for his dedication, disregard for his personal safety, and tactical leadership. However, this statement was highly controversial. Critics argue that Slabinski's actions, as portrayed in some accounts, don't align with the standards of the Medal of Honor. This medal typically requires recipients to have demonstrated conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of their own life above and beyond the call of duty. And according to critics, leaving a wounded comrade, even if believed to be dead, doesn't exactly meet this criterion. Supporters of Slabinski, on the other hand, argue that he made difficult decisions under extreme circumstances and displayed exceptional leadership throughout the mission, which makes him deserving of the recognition. As things stand, the recording of the battle is what allowed Chapman to receive this award, as it put a stop to the misinformation and ensured that his bravery and sacrifice were properly recognized. Justice might be slow, but it's inevitable. In all, Chapman's list of awards and decorations includes Air Force Cross, Purple Heart, Air Force Commendation Medal with 1 device, Joint Service Achievement Medal with 1 device, Air Force Achievement Medal with 1 device, Air Force Outstanding Unit Award with 2 devices, Air Force Good Conduct Medal with 4 devices, National Defense Service Medal, Air Force Longevity Service Award with 3 devices, Non-Commissioned Officer Professional Military Education Ribbon, Small Arms Expert Marksmanship Ribbon, Air Force Training Ribbon, and of course, the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor was presented to Chapman's family, which includes his wife, Valerie Nessel, and their two daughters Madison and Brianna, as well as his mother, Terry Chapman. At the time of his demise, he was also survived by his father, Eugene Chapman, who passed away in 2016. John Chapman is remembered as a dedicated father and husband, and a true American hero. His courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to his fellow soldiers continue to serve as an inspiration to all. More importantly, what do you think of Chapman's actions in Afghanistan? Have you ever heard of a more dramatic and courageous last stand? And how do you view the awarding of the Medal of Honor to Slabinski? Share your stories in the comments section below, and thank you for watching this video. Now go and check out how the US completely overpowered Iraq in only 100 hours, or click this other video instead.